In 1941, at the height of the Second World War, the Soviet Union found itself facing the might of Nazi Germany and its allies alone. While the members of the anti-Hitler coalition were indeed engaged in combat with the Reich, it was exclusively the Red Army on the European mainland that stood toe-to-toe with the German forces on land. To alleviate the pressure on the Eastern Front, the Soviet leadership urgently pressed for the establishment of a Second Front. For a considerable period, the Allies primarily provided material assistance to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. In early September of 1941, Stalin candidly communicated to the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, stating that the Soviet Union was facing an existential threat and requested the creation of a second front within that same year, either in the Balkans or in France, with the aim of drawing away at least 30 to 40 German divisions. The United States had not yet entered the war against Germany by that juncture. Nevertheless, Churchill, acknowledging that the brunt of the war's burden had fallen upon Russia, declined to commit British troops to a European landing. Negotiations persisted. During the Second Moscow Conference, Churchill again informed Stalin that he deemed the opening of a second front in 1942 to be unfeasible. This period proved exceptionally challenging for the Allied powers. The Germans were achieving victories in Africa, while the Red Army was retreating from Rostov-on-Don. As territory in the Caucasus was lost, fierce engagements raged near Ruzev and Stalingrad. Despite these setbacks, Churchill, upon meeting with Stalin in the Kremlin, refrained from promising the establishment of a second front before 1943. He explained that a landing in Europe was impossible due to insufficient forces, further compounded by adverse weather conditions that hindered any crossing of the English Channel, the body of water separating Britain from France. In response, the Soviet leader launched a tirade of accusations against the British Prime Minister, condemning the Allies for their indecisiveness. Churchill then assured Stalin that the Allies would launch an amphibious assault in North Africa and conduct a reconnaissance and force operation in France. Merely a couple of days following the Moscow Conference, British forces landed near the French town of Dieppe. However, the capture of the port proved unsuccessful in the swift engagement that ensued, and the landing force was utterly vanquished. The bitter experience of the Dieppe failure vividly demonstrated to the Allied command the necessity of providing sea support for amphibious operations with substantial naval vessels and air power. At Dieppe, nothing larger than destroyers was deployed, and their gunfire could not inflict any significant damage on the German defenses. Concurrently, Stalin did not consider the Allied landings in North Africa to be a genuine second front. The German Afrika Korps was a distinct operational grouping that had no bearing on the course of military operations on the Eastern Front. Following the defeat of Rommel's forces in Africa, Roosevelt and Churchill resolved to initiate landings in Sicily, aiming to gain control of shipping in the Mediterranean Sea and deliver a crippling blow to Hitler's primary ally, Italy. Although the conflict in Italy diverted approximately 1 million German soldiers, the Italian theater of war was not recognized by the Kremlin as the definitive second front. The Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General George Marshall, held a similar perspective. He viewed the Mediterranean approach as auxiliary to the principal objective, the Allied crossing of the English Channel and a subsequent landing in northern France. Finally, at the Tehran Conference in November of 1943, the Allies pledged to Stalin that a landing in Europe would occur in 1944. Churchill proposed attacking the Balkans instead of landing in France. However, both Stalin and Roosevelt united in opposition to his plan. The President of the United States even had to persuade Churchill that if the British declined the landing in 1944, the Americans would withdraw their troops from England and be compelled to redeploy their idle landing craft to the Pacific. The Allied amphibious operation in northern France was codenamed Overlord, which translates to Supreme Ruler, while the actual naval landing on the beaches of Normandy was known as Operation Neptune. The development of the landing plan was entrusted to the British General Frederick Morgan. Numerous military commanders, who were destined to prepare troops for the upcoming Normandy landing, including Generals Montgomery and Bradley, were recalled to England from the Italian front, which had become a secondary theater. American forces were transferred from across the ocean to the British Isles, where they immediately commenced intensive training. The most formidable challenge for the Allies was selecting the landing site. Adequate resupply for a large amphibious force necessitated a port with piers, yet all ports along the Atlantic coast had been transformed by the Germans into impregnable fortresses. The success of the operation hinged on the rapidity with which significant infantry and armored forces could be accumulated on the captured beachhead, forces capable of repelling a German counterattack. An unconventional yet singularly feasible solution was proposed by John Hill Hallett, the naval commander of the Dieppe landing. His assertion was, "If we cannot capture a port, we must bring one with us." The decision was made to secure a beachhead inland from the ports and construct an artificial harbor from reinforced concrete. Piers and breakwaters, designated by the codename Mulberry, were cast hollow and towed to the Normandy beaches. To conceal the Allied plans, the British government, at the insistence of the United States, imposed a special regime in the coastal regions of southern England where the troops prepared for the landing were stationed. To counter the impending invasion, the German command in France, Belgium, and Holland had nearly 900,000 personnel at its disposal in early June of 1944. Theoretically, these represented a considerable force. However, the German units were dispersed over a vast area, allowing the Allies to establish localized superiority at any chosen landing point with relative ease. Significant debate arose among the German commanders regarding the strategy for repelling the invasion. Army Group B Commander Erwin Rommel, possessing considerable experience in warfare against the Allies, believed that the success of the landing would be decided within the first 24 hours of the battle. Consequently, he advocated for maintaining a strong defensive posture along the coast with armored formations. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief of the German forces in the West, held a different view. He proposed keeping the tanks positioned inland, reasoning that they would be vulnerable to naval gunfire and could be employed to defeat the enemy in a mobile battle if a landing occurred. In response, Rommel highlighted the Allied air supremacy. Fighter bombers constantly overhead rendered any troop movements extremely hazardous. Ultimately, Hitler sanctioned a compromise. 3 armor divisions were allocated to Rommel, 3 to Rundstedt, and an additional 4 were held in reserve by the Supreme Command. A substantial impediment to the implementation of either strategy was the fact that many German mobile formations in Normandy had recently been withdrawn from the Eastern Front for reorganization and had largely lost their combat effectiveness. In the interim, the most dire situation for the Germans was the disparity in air power. The Luftwaffe's 3rd Air Force possessed approximately 500 aircraft. The Allies could counter this with over 7,000 combat aircraft. The Normandy landings were preceded by a massive aerial offensive lasting several weeks, intended to cripple the enemy's transportation infrastructure. The Atlantic Wall, under construction since 1942, offered some hope of success to the Germans. This extensive line of fortifications stretched along the coast. However, the primary focus of reinforcement was on the ports and their surrounding areas. Therefore, the Allied concept of constructing an artificial harbor provided them with a pathway to attack the least fortified positions. In addition to obstacles on the shore, the Germans had erected impediments at sea. Metal hedgehogs and concrete pyramids were designed to breach the hulls of landing craft, prompting the Allied command to decide on landing during low tide, when these obstacles would become visible. Before the tide returned, combat engineers were tasked with demolishing the obstructions hindering access to the shore. The initial date set for the landing was June 5, 1944, but on the morning of the 4th, the invasion was postponed by 24 hours in anticipation of improved weather conditions. That same evening, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, made the decision to commence the invasion on Tuesday, June 6th. A seemingly minor detail worked in favor of the Allies. Shortly before the operation began, Allied forces had dislodged German meteorological stations in the North Atlantic. Consequently, amidst the storms, the Germans remained unaware of a brief period of favorable weather. Erwin Rommel, upon reviewing the stormy forecast, calmly departed for a family vacation, utterly convinced that no invasion would occur in the immediate future. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in world history, codenamed Operation Overlord, commenced in France. Minutes after midnight, the airborne assault began. In Normandy, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with the British 6th Airborne Division, were deployed. The paratroopers managed to evade specialized anti-invasion obstacles by landing closer to the coast. Due to disorientation, the airborne deployment was scattered over a wide area, but they ultimately accomplished their objectives. Several crucial bridges were captured, and some were destroyed to impede German reinforcements from reaching the landing zone. At 3 o'clock in the morning, 2,000 British and American bombers attacked the coastline. This aerial raid was followed at 5:25 in the morning by a massive bombardment of German positions by ships of the Allied fleet. It seemed as though nothing would survive the onslaught of heavy shells on the shore. Precisely at 6:30, the infantry began disembarking from the landing craft. The landing was immediately met with a furious barrage of machine gun and artillery fire. Amphibious Sherman tanks, equipped with waterproof screens and propellers, were intended to support the initial wave of the landing. A logical question arises at this point. How then did the infamous Omaha Beach, so vividly depicted in Steven Spielberg's legendary film, Saving Private Ryan, occur? At Omaha, the tanks were launched too far from the shore. Waves inundated them, and they sank. As a result, more than half of the amphibious tanks that were supposed to support the main American forces landing at Omaha went to the bottom without reaching the shore. The few amphibious tanks that did reach the coast provided invaluable assistance to the landed infantry, neutralizing German machine gun nests. The tanks themselves soon came under fire from anti-tank cannons and concrete pillboxes. The situation was saved by the arrival of landing craft, which approached the shoreline closely. Under their covering fire, the German pillboxes fell silent one by one. Despite overcoming the initial crisis on Omaha Beach, the situation remained precarious. Specialized teams tasked with detonating the underwater obstacles had sustained casualties. Only a few narrow corridors were successfully created through the barrier system. The Allied command had anticipated that the Omaha sector would be defended by second-rate German units, unaware that soldiers of the 35th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht, including many veterans of the Eastern Front, were stationed there. Following the initial wave of landings, more transport and landing ships arrived at Omaha, disgorging troops and equipment, which, under hurricane force bombardment, caught fire and sank. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the Americans had secured a beachhead and begun unloading troops. A total of 34,000 individuals landed in the Omaha sector. The capture of this sector cost the American Fifth Corps 4,700 soldiers and officers, 60 vessels and boats, 50 tanks, and 26 artillery pieces were lost. However, almost everywhere, with the exception of Omaha Beach, the Germans were unable to offer significant resistance to the Allies. The American landing at the second sector, Utah, proceeded relatively smoothly. Utah was located at the base of the codenamed Peninsula, which was less heavily fortified by the Germans, as landing on the peninsula and then pushing inland would have been strategically pointless. However, this sector proved useful for securing the flank and linking up with the airborne divisions. Approximately company-sized German units defended Utah, and the amphibious tanks emerging from the water quickly eliminated the machine gun nests. American casualties numbered around 200. The landing of British and Canadian forces at the Gold, Juno, and Sword sectors was considerably more successful. In the middle of June 6th, ships towing the Mulberry harbor construction units proceeded to the landing areas. The construction of the artificial harbor commenced directly on the sand, enabling the supply of a large force, including tanks and artillery. By the close of D-Day, 156,000 personnel and several thousand pieces of equipment, including 500 tanks, had been deployed on the coast. The Second Front in Europe was officially opened. Allied casualties during the landings totaled approximately 10,000. German losses, according to various estimates, range from 4,000 to 9,000 soldiers and officers. Upon learning of the landings, Hitler was reluctant to authorize the use of reserves, still believing that the main Allied invasion would occur at the port of Calais. This strategic miscalculation would later prove very costly for the Germans. On June 18th, the Allies blockaded German units on the Cotentin Peninsula, and on June 26th, they captured the strategically vital port of Cherbourg. Nevertheless, there was still a lag behind the planned schedule. One of the primary objectives for the first day of landings in the British sector was the city of Caen, a crucial road junction. It could not be captured immediately. The advancing Canadians encountered a counterattack from the German 21st Panzer Division. The battles for Caen would become the epicenter of military operations for the subsequent month and a half. The Allies relentlessly bombarded the city with heavy aircraft, but success remained elusive. Following a brief operational pause, the Germans attempted to dislodge the landing force, but they lacked the necessary strength. This was partly because, as early as April, the German command had been compelled to redeploy the 2nd Panzer Corps SS from France to Ukraine. However, the Allied attempts to advance from the beachhead also initially met with failure. By the summer of 1944, the Germans had already commenced mass production of the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks. When the British attempted to break out from their sector into operational space on June 15th, they encountered the heavy tanks of the SS Panzer Regiment 101 in the village of Villers-Bocage. The German Tigers wrought havoc upon the British tanks in the streets of Villers-Bocage. A series of offensive operations in the British sector of Normandy were met with the fire of new German tanks, anti-tank guns, and anti-aircraft artillery. The armor of all Allied tanks was confidently penetrated by German cannons. The Allies possessed heavy bombers, which effectively carpet-bombed German cities, railway stations, and bridges. However, they were ill-suited for precision bombing of individual positions at the front line. Ultimately, the Allies succeeded only in isolating the theater of operations by destroying all bridges and railway junctions in Normandy. But they were unable to dislodge German combat units and frontline positions that moved under the cover of darkness. Adding to the list of challenges, the infamous bocage, earth embankments with dense shrubbery separating French peasant fields, proved to be a significant obstacle for the Americans and British. Tanks advancing through them became bogged down. The specter of World War I-style trench warfare loomed increasingly large before the Allies, a scenario they were determined to avoid at all costs. The turning point in the Normandy battles occurred only at the end of July 1944, when sufficiently large forces had been amassed in the American sector. Concurrently, the Germans concentrated their primary efforts on holding Caen. This finally allowed for a devastating blow to be struck, breaking out into operational space. General Patton's American Third Army tanks initially struck southward, then turned eastward, encircling a large German contingent near Falaise. As a result, nearly 50,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were taken prisoner. This success would have been impossible without invaluable intelligence from British decryption efforts. English cryptographers had managed to break German codes and were reading radio transmissions from headquarters almost as quickly as the German commanders to whom they were intended. Patton precisely knew that there were no enemy forces to the south and boldly turned towards the area conspicuously marked as empty on the map. Consequently, the German defenses were breached immediately. The defeat of the Germans in the Falaise pocket marked the conclusion of the Battle of Normandy. The Wehrmacht suffered a catastrophic defeat. By August 25th, the Allies had reached the Seine, liberated Paris, and occupied all of northwestern France. The road to Germany was finally open before the Allies.